During the morning, did you think at any time the ship would go down?
Well, I had sort of premonitions more. I didn't really ever think it would until it really started listening about quarter past one.
How did you get to shore?
Well, I got out into the water just after the last lifeboat had left, and I got pulled into that. I landed in the water near it, and it got swamped and later turned over. A lot of people sort of hung on to it. Some were washed off by the waves. Finally, we were picked up after a couple of hours, I suppose, by the pilot launch.
Were you suffering from exposure?
Oh, pretty cold and that, but not really bad. Had no feeling in the hands or the feet.
What were conditions like up to the time that the ship was abandoned?
Oh, they were pretty hopeless. The wind was about 100 miles an hour or something. Luckily, it fell quite a lot just when everybody started getting off, but the waves were 30 feet, so especially out right in the middle of the harbour.
How much have you lost?
Something just over $200, I would say. At some clothes and cricket gear.
Where did you get the clothes you're wearing now?
Bought them in Wellington yesterday morning. They were charged up to the union's team for coming out. I think they're paying for all that.
Will you travel on the ferries again?
Well, probably. Not immediately, but I can't see any reason for not travelling.
Mr. Spears, when did the water first pour into the engine room?
I think as soon as we hit the reef, she was fairly reasonably holed in and it came straight in.
Be pretty deep?
I wouldn't know, really.
And was there any established drill for the engine crew in emergencies like that?
Yes, we all have our job to do, and it was done to the best of their ability.
Might get to shut watertight doors or something?
They're controlled from the bridge.
Now, there's been conflicting reports of just how orderly the evacuation was. What was your impression of it?
Well, I was one of the last to leave the engine room, of course, and the drill for getting over the side was well underway by the time I got on deck. And we had a big list on, which was causing a lot of people to slip and knock other people over, which didn't add to, sort of caused a bit of congestion, really, and that seemed to be it.
There was no screaming? Or...
Not really, no.
Now, how did you get to shore yourself?
I was able to get off into a life raft, which, after being washed across the other side of the harbour, was upturned on me.
And was the people in the raft with you?
Yes, I got thrown clear, but everyone else was trapped underneath it. And a man that was in it managed to swim out from underneath and get on top of the raft. We had a pocket knife, and we cut the bottom out of the raft and got out what we could, but 3 were drowned.
Out of that raft you're on?
Yes.
And will you go back to sea now that this ordeal's over?
Oh, yes, I think so. Quite prepared to go back.
Lying in bed when I felt a shudder through the vessel, and I thought perhaps the waves were such that the screw was turning out of the water, and I said to my companion, you know, it feels rather odd. I continued to read the paper, and then later on an announcement came over the tannoy system of the ship, which I can quote because afterwards I decided to fill in time by writing down in chronological order the time and the actual messages which were going on, and it stated this vessel is aground on Barrett's Reef and there is no immediate danger, and the passengers were instructed to don life jackets and remain in their cabins. Ross and I looked at one another and wondered whether our number was up at all, but as time progressed it appeared safe. At 7:40 a message came over the tannoy to the effect that a tug was on its way to assist the vessel, and passengers were asked to refrain from smoking. This proved a valid point because sometime later petrol fumes could be smelt in the air, obviously from overturned cars in the hold. I walked around and tried to get some reactions from the passengers. They were pale, generally quiet. Elderly people had been put on the stairways and were wrapped in blankets. Several people were sick and they were in cabins beside the passageways and companionways. Most of the passengers were on B and on C deck. I happened to be on C deck at that time. I walked out and I spoke to Mr. and Mrs. Schiegel, I think the name was. And as fate had turned out, he had just spent some time living on board the Wanganella, was it? That was the previous ship that had struck Barrett's Reef. They had a little 18 months old son called Oscar with them, and they were on C deck. I then moved up to B deck, and there were sounds of community singing going on, and I discovered a group of the Women's Division of the Royal New Zealand Air Force were on leave for Easter, and they were conducting a sing-song. People were being ill through the rolling of the vessel. Then more towards 8:20, the situation on board as far as passengers were concerned was an air of doubt. More or less, will we be right with this weather? I mean, what can a tug do in such atrocious weather and water conditions that were surrounding us? The wind was whipping rain and spray with razor-like sharpness practically. I opened one window on one occasion and got stung. And I saw, previous to this, I had seen pieces of wood being torn away from what appeared to be life rafts, and this in actual fact what it was. Generally, passengers were quite confident at this stage, and members of the crew were walking around and people were asking them how things were, and they were quite confident, and they passed no comment, of course. But by about 8:30, most people were more or less in their gangways, and passengers ready to move to muster stations if necessary. I, for one, never heard the call to move to muster stations until 08:38. The general lighting went off and emergency lighting came on, and then at 8:45 an announcement came over the tannoy which stated, would all passengers move to B deck? Bar stewards and other stewards, please assist in this movement. Passenger reaction was quick, efficient, and smooth in this movement. No problems were experienced at all. At 9 o'clock exactly, an announcement came over the tannoy which stated, we wish to assure passengers that everything is under control. This was repeated. Then it stated passengers are requested to stay on B deck. This was also repeated. Between 9:20 and 9:30, stewards came around with packets of biscuits and trays of cut meat and so forth. And then at 9:44, an exact announcement stated that we wish to advise passengers that the vessel has drifted into the harbour itself, and we are not out in the open sea, and there is nothing to worry about at all times. This was repeated 3 times. One sort of felt great relief at this stage, and there was some hysterical laughter, you know, we're safe after all. Then at 36 minutes past 9 came an announcement. We wish to advise passengers that we are inside the harbour and quite safe. This again was repeated 3 times. Nothing much happened from then on. The vessel was more or less stable. And then at 10:20, the general lighting came on throughout the vessel. And then at 10:25, an announcement came over which said, we would remind passengers we are perfectly safe and inside the harbour and not in the open sea. This message was repeated. And then at about 10:30, what appeared to be an engine noise of some description ceased. One could only speculate as to what that was, what it meant. At 10:39, another message came over the tannoy. We remind passengers we are still drifting up the harbour and we are perfectly safe. This message was repeated at 10:51, but at this stage the vessel was rolling quite badly. I sighted a tug approaching, and then at 11 o'clock I listened to the NZBC news through a transistor and heard of the troubles that you were having ashore. At the same time, a message came over the announcement, the tannoy, that stated we have to advise that there is a tug standing by now. There is a tug standing by now. And then at 11:35 I sighted the tug and a pilot launch. And then as a crew member came past at about 11:43, I spoke to him, and he was an able seaman, and he gave me an unofficial statement that we're tug fast and we're about to weigh anchor. At 11:56 came a message that we request all passengers to stay on B deck and not to move about the vessel. We have a tug with a line made fast and we will be towed into Wellington very shortly. This message was repeated again, and then I come to my tatty pieces of paper, which are somewhat sea-washed. At 12:10 the tannoy gave a summary of the NZBC news, and then at 12:42 an announcement which stated we wish to advise passengers that the vessel is still perfectly safe, the tug still has a line fast and hopes to tow us towards Wellington shortly. This was repeated. At 1 o'clock a message came over the tannoy system paging a few people, and opposite me in a cabin was a certain Mrs. Anderson, I think, with 2 young children, and said, "That's me, I can't possibly go down." So I went down to the purser's office and told the purser that this lady was in cabin B 242 or something, and I saw crew members standing on the sea deck companionway, and the purser's office was the next deck below. Whilst talking to the purser, I looked down the stairwell and I saw water and flotsam. I then proceeded back to B deck to my fellow passenger and told him what I had seen. And at this stage there was quite a list on the vessel, which seemed to be getting worse every time we rolled from where I was standing. When the vessel rolled back again, I couldn't see the horizon. So we considered that we weren't out of the woods at all and we would probably be in the water. Shortly after this, an announcement came over the tannoy system which stated, would all passengers move to the starboard side of the vessel? Would all passengers move to the starboard side of the vessel? There was some confusion as to this. People had lost orientation. They didn't know which was the sharp end or which was the blunt end or which was the starboard or port side. This message was repeated with a degree of urgency. Several minutes later, I shouted to a steward, asked him where the devil was starboard. He indicated to me. I then made my way towards the starboard side, leading some women. But the people some of the passengers had dragged luggage out into the passageways, and some people were sleeping there. There were chairs there. I came across a whole family group of about 6 without their life jackets on, and this was at a critical stage, and they were shouting for their life jackets. A woman found them in the corner, passed them to me, and I passed them over the heads to these people. There was an old man searching for his glasses, and he would have been crushed by the people. I pulled him up, and he didn't have his life jacket on, so I fastened that around him. And then the flow of passengers stopped towards the side with the list. So I made my way forward to ascertain what the hold-up was, and women had taken their shoes off and were slipping in their stockinged feet on the wet deck and were frightened to move. So I barged forward and grabbed 3 women and pulled them towards the exit door. There was a steward there encouraging people to come out. There was a very elderly lady in the doorway of the smoke room who wouldn't move, and someone pulled her out. I grabbed hold of 2 women who wouldn't come. One wouldn't leave her mother and one wouldn't leave her husband. I pulled them forward to the exit door, and the steward took them to the boat. I then lost my footing and ended up in the scuppers. I stood up and I saw that all the lifeboats had been launched and were in the sea. So I said to a crew member, "What now?" He said, "You'll have to jump for it." So I made my way along to a hole in the railing and jumped into the water. I swam about for a bit and the lifeboat passed me, so I grabbed hold of one of the loops of rope on the front right-hand side. And after about 5 minutes, an arm came down and lifted me in. Whilst we were there, we cruised up and down. The motor started on the lifeboat and we cruised up and down the now seriously listing Wahine. And we made our way towards the stern of the vessel, where I observed my fellow passenger, and I shouted to him, "Jump," which he did. And someone grabbed a boat hook and he and I pulled him towards the lifeboat, which was very, had a lot of people in it, and there was only about this much freeboard. We made our way past the stern of the Wahine and out towards the middle of the harbour, towards a tug. Waves were breaking over me and the vessel was filling with, the lifeboat was filling with water. We approached the tug, the motor was still going, but a wave came across and filled the lifeboat with water and cut the motor out. And we drifted up to the stern of the tug, and a swell came down and brought the stern of the tug down onto the side of the lifeboat above me. We then pushed ourselves away, and the tug, we drifted away, and then rather about a 20-footer came across and overturned the lifeboat. We were more or less scattered, and some were in groups. I didn't know whether to make for the shore, make for the tug, or make for about this much of the lifeboat which was out of the water. I decided on the latter course and held on to a piece of rope. The tug circled about, attempting to pick up some passengers, but I got the impression that they were too weak to pull themselves up the side of the tug. I heard a whistle blowing, a distress whistle from a life jacket, and heard a man calling out help. And I saw this fellow about 200 yards out towards the open sea. We were drifting towards the rocks Eastbourne way, and there was a lady, about 30, who had drifted away from us, and I called her to swim back, and she answered, "I can't kick." I encouraged her to try and swim back to the vessel, but then another wave came, and swept some of us away from the lifeboat. And we shouted to the tug to come back and called and waved. One of the elderly ladies hanging onto the lifeboat had lost her husband from the lifeboat. He had slipped out of his jacket somehow. And we were generally distressed and starting to suffer from exposure at this stage. And the wind was quite cold, as was the water. And the waves were getting bigger and bigger. And then we sighted what I think was the pilot vessel. And that came towards us and started to pick up single survivors who'd moved away from the group. And this was encouraging, and then I looked over and I saw the Aramoana, was it? And my immediate reaction was, don't send us big ones, send us dozens of little ones. We called and waved to what I presume was the pilot boat. At that stage it didn't appear to be taking any notice of us, and we thought all was gone. And so we more or less concentrated on looking out for the waves, and I shouted out several times, "Hold tight, take a breath," and along would come a big 30-footer and go over us or something. But most of us managed to hold on. The next thing I realised was that this launch had come closer to us and was picking up people, and then it practically surfed past us, and I made a grab for the first piece of rope and missed, the second piece and missed, and the third piece I held on to. The next thing I knew was that a rather strong and friendly arm had yanked me on board, and I was directed to take off my life jacket, but someone whipped it off me, and I was helped down a stairways into the hull of this vessel. There were about 10 people down there, and then some more people came down. There was an injured man there, and several sobbing women, and several people were violently ill. And somebody handed around cigarettes. We couldn't hold them. And then we got buffeted about in this little hole, and we finally felt the gaunching. And we were at a wharf. We were led up the stairs and along a wharf, I don't know what it was. And someone grabbed hold of me, wrapped a blanket around me, and led me onto the bus. And someone put a cardboard carton of hot soup in my hand, which I couldn't hold. And then we drove, I think, through Mount Victoria Tunnel. We were all shivering and no one was talking much. And then we arrived at the railway station, gave our names to the police on duty, and moved into the refreshment room. And some kind person thrust a plate of sausages and peas or something at me, which I'm afraid I couldn't have looked at.